I was just thinking about it. I'm really not sure whether this is a great presentation to have at lunchtime, because what you'll be seeing is that the rations for Gallipoli soldiers were not that great, and I will be talking about bully beef, biscuits and scurvy for Gallipoli rations. Now I just want to make sure that this is working. There's the title of my talk. When we come to the Gallipoli Campaign, the high point for both New Zealand and Australia was really the August offensive, where we the attack against Chinook Bear, Lone Pine and so forth. But the physical condition of both Australian and New Zealand soldiers on the eve of the 1915 August offensive was very poor. There were several reasons for this. There is the effect of climate and terrain. There's the effect of frontline service, which erodes a person's condition anyway. But more importantly for the talk I'm giving today, there was the effect of the poor diet of Gallipoli soldiers. And that diet consisted pretty much of the following. Bully beef, sometimes called corned beef, and make no mistake, there's no corn in it. It's an old English term meaning small crystals of salt. So it's basically beef that's been preserved in salt. Army biscuits, and I'll show you a sample of those, black tea and jam, and that made up the bulk of the diet for soldiers on Gallipoli. Sometimes there was additional rations, some onions, some lime juice, some usually fatty bacon, some rice, but it was sporadic and not consistent. So bully beef, i.e. corned beef, and hardtack biscuits were the staple diet for New Zealanders on Gallipoli. And I give you a quote from Fred Waite, the first New Zealand historian. He says that food was always plentiful, except for during the Great Storm. But then he goes on to say that tinned meat, jam and hard biscuits and a mug of tea made up 99% of the meals that were served on Gallipoli. And the most decorated member of the medical corps, Charles Begg, noted while serving on this hospital ship in the middle of June 1915 that it is a curious fact that for the best part of a year on bully beef and biscuits, so he's been eating it for a year, the sight of decently prepared food is distasteful to one and no one looks forward to meals very much. I want you to keep that loss of appetite in mind when I talk about the disease scurvy later on. William McNamara, another doctor who was served on the campaign till the end, wrote in his diary this: "I've been sick for 3 days. I've never eaten a bite. I feel savage and I just want to be left alone. I've had too much meat and tea, no potatoes or green vegetables." And Macaroons was evacuated sick with dysentery 2 days after writing this in his diary. So we move on and look at the main staple diet. And here we have a photograph of the Huntley and Palmer's number 4. I noticed in their advertisements of those two urbane gentlemen going around trying to sell Huntley and Palmer biscuits, they never mentioned this one, and I think that there's a good reason for that. But just very briefly, I'll talk about a bully beef to start with. Corned beef, the main protein source. The bully beef on Gallipoli did not come from New Zealand. It came from Argentina, specifically a brand called the Fray Bentos brand. Now, as you probably know, bully beef is naturally salty and it's naturally greasy, but the Argentine beef was of particularly poor quality. It was stringy, it was extra salty, and its poor quality meant that it deteriorated even faster in the heat than normal varieties. Now, Fred Waite, who I mentioned before, said that its poor quality and the fact that you had to eat it for 3 meals a day became more than the constitution of a New Zealander can stand. Now, that poor quality of the meat being served on Gallipoli actually became a political issue back in New Zealand, when one of the members of the opposition asked the Minister for Defence a question without notice, and here's the question he asks, and I'm just going to sum it up, I'm not going to read it out in full. He's basically saying, why are our men getting crap bully beef on Gallipoli when we know we can produce beef of our own of much better quality? Of course, this is the type of question ministers hate, a question without notice, particularly when they give an answer like this. Basically, I don't know. We supply the meat to the UK and they do with it what they want to. And basically all the New Zealand meat is going to soldiers in France. Now, one Australian soldier, I'm going to quote from Australians because they have a particular handle on soldier vernacular, which I'm going to talk about later on. One Australian soldier described Fray Bentos bully beef, I'm quoting from his diary, "It's nothing but cat's meat floating around in a tin of oil and we hate it." Okay, you can see why. Now, there was an inquiry on all aspects of Gallipoli after the Gallipoli Campaign, and it focused on the food. And if you ever want a report that says something dressed up in what it actually doesn't mean, this is it. There's the Faye Bentos bully beef, and this is what the report of the Dardanelles Commission said. There's nothing actually injurious to health in the meat, but it's of poor quality, it's very salty, it's stringy, and it caused intestinal irritation and diarrhoea. But apart from that, there's nothing wrong with it. Yes, it is a peculiar statement. Now, a historian of food fed to soldiers, Rachel Duffett, and I'm quoting from a book that she did 2 years ago, she writes, and I quote, "Bully beef as an alternative to fresh meat was generally met with approval only by the very hungriest of soldiers. Nobody really wanted to eat it if they had a choice." Now, the other staple I mentioned is this, the number 4 the Huntley and Palmer's biscuits, known as Hardtack, made of flour and water with a little bit of salt and baked dry until it's rock hard. Now, the Army loved supplying Hardtack biscuits because they were portable and they kept for years and years. And of course, the longer you keep them, the harder they get. But unfortunately, soldiers dislike them because they taste of nothing, and I have eaten some. I'm sure Mark remembers them with fondness too. And the hardness made them difficult to eat. You get an impression of how hard they are from this quote of this New Zealand soldier I'm going to put up in a minute. Now, this is Sergeant Ralph Smith. He arrives with the New Zealand division in France. They're surrounded by a lot of hungry French children, so they give them their iron rations, that is a can of bully beef, and they give them their Hardtack biscuits. And one little girl comes back to say thank you, and she says this, "Little girl, my mother gives you many thanks for the bully beef, but she returns your plates." That is fair comment on our Hardtack biscuits. Now, I've got to say, Hardtack biscuits were put to other uses as well. And here's one that's been turned into a rather fetching picture frame, which is in the Imperial War Museum. There is in our museum in Waihuru, there is a Hardtack biscuit which actually is a letter. Somebody's written a letter on it, put a stamp on it and posted it back, and it survived entirely. And you can read it quite well. Now, getting back to the Australians, because they have they have lovely terms and so forth. The Australians had a great name for Army biscuits. They call them concrete macaroons, and I think that is a wonderful term. As one soldier recorded of this staple diet, our rations are 7 biscuits a day, very little each of jam, some tea and sugar. There's any amount of bully beef, but only because it is poor and barely edible. And he says, I have to struggle to get satisfied. It takes a lot of gnawing to fill up on biscuits, and 7 are as many as a man with ordinary jaws can handle. And he's actually quite right. Let me now move on and do something that hasn't been done before. Yes, it doesn't look that appetising, does it? Bully beef, biscuits and some jam is an inadequate diet. It will not maintain anybody at peak health for any length of time. Now, in 1914, people actually knew in terms of food science, they knew about calories and how much people had to consume to get daily energy. What they didn't know about was vitamins and trace elements. They'd only actually been discovered about 1912, and nobody knew how important they were to a diet. And the role of vitamin, minerals and trace elements, etc., was not fully understood until after the war. And I have to say the link between scurvy and vitamin C, or ascorbic acid, was known for centuries, particularly known for thousands of years by the Chinese, known for centuries by the Royal Navy, but the link wasn't actually proven until 1932. And the diet of New Zealand soldiers, and we did it for Australians as well, has recently been subjected to detailed analysis by scientists and historians at the University of Otago and Massey University, and we published those results in the New Zealand Journal of Medicine last year in April 2013. And what that research showed was that the diet at Gallipoli was not only unappetising, monotonous, it was disabling bad. The diet actually lacks these things. It lacks 3 essential vitamins, vitamin A, C and E. It lacks other trace elements such as potassium, selenium and dietary fibre. And we took the study a little bit further and actually showed that if they had removed some of the meat that was being given and replaced it with canned vegetables and fruit, it would have eradicated all of these problems. And you can see it, I'm only going to put it up for the vitamins in this table here, which was prepared by a epidemiologist at Otago University. What this shows is that what you have in red is the actual diet. That's the amount of vitamin C, vitamin A and vitamin E that these soldiers are getting. This is the 100% line, which is recommended for disease prevention. If these soldiers aren't even getting 50% of the daily recommended dosage, and I'll come back to that later on. Before I look at the impact of this inadequate diet on health, there are 4 complicating factors relating to food, which I'm going to skim over very quickly, but they are important. And the first one is these, flies. This one here, sorry. Okay, flies. There were swarms of them on Gallipoli during the hot weather. And those flies fed on corpses, they fed on faeces in the uncovered latrines. They were particularly attracted to jam. In fact, jam seemed to drive them mad. It was impossible not to consume some flies with your food. Here is a letter from Leonard Hart, who says, you get the picture, is why I said probably not a good lunchtime talk. The smell of bodies was becoming intolerable and flies swarmed in millions. It was pitiful to see the wounded covered with them from head to foot and even too weak to chase them off. But the best description of the fly plague comes from an Australian light horse trooper, Eon Idris. And he says this: "We have just had dinner," note he puts in inverted commas. "My new mate wasn't well, so he couldn't eat, so I tried to, and I would have but for the flies. He has some biscuits, he opens up a tin of jam, and the flies buzz around him, and then he tries to shelter under his greatcoat, but the flies still get in, and he eats some with his jam. Finally, I threw the tin over the parapet. I nearly howled with rage. I feel so sulky I could chew everything to pieces. Of all the bastards of places, this is the greatest bastard in the world." Sorry, Australian vernacular, now you know where swearing like a trooper comes from. Now, that's the first complicating factor. Second complicating factor is tobacco. Now, tobacco, either cigarettes or pipe tobacco, was one of the few comforts available to Gallipoli soldiers at the time. It was supplied as part of the rations. It was given as a medication. As soon as a wounded soldier set foot upon a hospital ship, they were given a smoke, and it was supposed to be, as I say, used for medicinal purposes. Most soldiers became heavy smokers, and obviously not knowing the detrimental effects of tobacco. There's one lesser side effect of tobacco that's very pertinent to the diet on Gallipoli. Remember that graph I showed you? They're not even getting 50% of the vitamin C required. Well, if they're a heavy smoker, that's being eroded by 40% as well. So nicotine destroys concentrations of vitamin C in soldiers' bodies. Third one to look at, and this picture always makes me grimace, and you can see why. Okay. The state of dental health in New Zealand 1914 was appalling. 35% of medical rejections in 1914 were based on the state of teeth and the soldiers' mouths. You can imagine the effect of eating some rock-hard biscuits, concrete macaroons, as your main source of carbohydrates when you have bad teeth. And this is a comment from Rachel Duffett. Even men with good teeth found it a challenge. If you had bad teeth, it could verge on the torturous. And many New Zealand soldiers had bad teeth. I'll give you one example. This gentleman here, Walter Ledley, known as Bill. And he says this. He's got false teeth, by the way. They're all out. So, "I broke my bottom set of teeth on board the transport ship through eating hard biscuits. So they're broken. And then I lost the top set. So how does he eat his biscuits? He has to get his biscuits and pound them between 2 stones on the beach, turn them into a powder, and then mix them with his bully beef. Little wonder that soldiers would nibble away at the edges and throw the centre into no man's land." Last complicating factor is this, water. It's in very short supply. 2 quarts a day, the normal ration, 1.9 litres, and that is used for everything, for washing, drinking, making tea, cooking, all of those things. 1.9 litres. Little wonder that Fred Waite would say water was desperately short, and a soldier would record in his diary, "Water is worth its weight in gold on the peninsula." If you can imagine what it is like to be in the hot sun with those rock-hard biscuits and salty bully beef as your main source of protein, it must have been a torment. And for this gentleman it was. And he's from Dunedin. He says, "I find myself thinking of the cold stream around Dunedin with maddening persistence and wondering why I didn't drink more when I had the chance. I find the best thing to do is to drink as little as possible during the day, save the water for a drink after sundown. One is then able to get to sleep instead of lying awake with a dry tongue, counting the hours till the morning issue." Now I want to move on and talk about scurvy at Gallipoli, because all the medical reports that came out of the peninsula fudge this issue unless they're dealing with Indian soldiers. This is what our medical history said about it. There was a sanitary commissioner came out, he inspected the lines of the New Zealand Australian Division, he advised to obviously fly-proof the latrines, enforce the chlorination of drinking water, and this commissioner noticed the state of the men's mouths, and he said there's a lot of gingivitis and pyorrhea around, which is evident of scurvy. And then it says, well, there was some scurvy, but it's mainly amongst the Indians. Let me point out some facts about scurvy. It is a disease of malnutrition caused by the lack of vitamin C. Vitamin C cannot be stored in the body, it needs to be replenished daily. Scurvy had decimated armies in the recent past. In the Crimean War, for example, 85% of illnesses were caused by acute scurvy. There was nearly 50,000 cases in the Union Army during the US Civil War. Scurvy is a three-stage disease. Here is stage 1, which kicks in after 3 months vitamin C deficiency. You have a compromised nervous system, soldiers get irritable, there is uncontrolled mood swings, there's a loss of appetite, rapid breathing, diarrhoea, and so on. Nearly every account I've read of a Gallipoli soldier expresses some of these symptoms. So that's in the early stage of scurvy. The second stage is this, kicks in after 6 months. This is where you get the bad teeth, the teeth falling out, the sore mouth, the skin complaints, the dry eyes, impaired wound healing. A lot of Gallipoli soldiers I've read indicate these symptoms. And the third stage, which moves on to full-blown scurvy, which is after 6 months of vitamin C deficiency. This is where you get the suppurating wounds, the eyes protruding, jaundice, the swelling, convulsions, and it can actually kill. And I have found some accounts of New Zealand soldiers in Gallipoli which actually express these symptoms. Now, Rachel Duffer, that historian I mentioned before, actually indicates that scurvy was present amongst British soldiers on the Western Front. And she says this, in a diet where fruit other than jam was virtually unheard of and vegetables other than potatoes, and even those were lacking, were rare, it is likely that the men were suffering from this intermediate submedical stage of the disease, i.e. stage 1 and stage 2 scurvy. The conclusions of the Otago and Massey University study expressed in that article was exactly the same. The rations at Gallipoli were nutritionally inadequate, and they're likely to have caused scurvy and contributed to high rates of other illnesses as well. And I will leave this today with this conclusion, and I really like this illustration because it's got everything I want. The Frey Bentos bully beef, the Hardtack, the number 4 army biscuits, the apricot jam, the matches, no rum, I didn't mention rum, and tobacco. There is little doubt that the rations at Gallipoli were totally inadequate. They contributed significantly to the poor health of New Zealand and Australian soldiers on the eve of the August offensive. If, as Napoleon said, an army does march on its stomach, then New Zealand soldiers cannot be expected to do much at all in August 1915. That they captured and held Chunuk Bair for a short time, I think is absolutely remarkable and a tribute to their determination, spirit and courage. That they failed to hold it was through no fault of their own. Now I'm going to leave you with a quote of Sidney Mintz, who is an American anthropologist and who studied food in great detail, and he says this, armies travel on their stomachs, it is generals who decide what to put in them. The nutritionally deficient ration at Gallipoli was just symptomatic of the poor planning that had dogged that campaign from its very inception. And I leave you with a nice bit of artwork on a hardtack biscuit at the Imperial War Museum. Thank you very much. Yeah, absolutely, and you're quite right. Flies on the North African campaign at Alamein were dreadful. Soldiers during the Second World War were fed on bully beef and biscuits, but not for 9 months duration, and there were attempts made to supplement the food with fresh rations whenever possible. After the First World War, there were a number of studies done, and food science advanced rapidly, where they actually discovered the importance of vitamins and trace elements and so forth. A lot of that was prompted by what happened at Gallipoli, but was even more prompted by the state of particularly children in Germany as a result of the blockade, who weren't getting fresh fruit or vegetables either. So by the Second World War, the understanding of food science was much more advanced. Troops were fed bully beef and biscuits, iron rations, but never for more than 4 or 5 days at a time, and certainly not for months. So the ration had greatly improved by that time. It is a very good question. You're quite right, and the Chinese have known about the link between scurvy and vitamin C for thousands of years. Captain Cook, as you know, used lime juice and so on. As I say, it's symptomatic of the poor planning that dogged Gallipoli from its beginning. What they were thinking was, and they totally underestimated their Turkish opponents, they were counting on a short, sharp campaign, and that they would be in Constantinople in a couple of weeks, and that therefore the soldiers and troops could exist on iron rations for that period of time. Bully beef and biscuits wouldn't make that much difference. Campaign dragged out, and dragged out for 9 months, and they just seemed to have an inability to actually get the stores, particularly fresh fruit and vegetables and so forth, get it to Gallipoli and distribute it out to the frontline troops where it was needed. And it was something that they didn't give a lot of attention to. And you're quite right, it's symptomatic of the poor planning that's dogged this campaign from its beginning. The ration greatly improved on the Western Front, and there were several reasons for that. They understood that the health of the men in August had deteriorated because of the poor ration. On the Western Front, they made huge efforts to supply them with fresh food, and the thing that really helped as well was the fact that New Zealand soldiers, believe it or not, and I know Mark will find this hard to believe, is that New Zealand soldiers in the First World War were actually quite well paid compared to their British equivalent. The Australians were paid the best. They were paid 6 shillings a day, we were paid 5 shillings a day, and everywhere the New Zealand soldiers went on the Western Front were these things called estaminets, where local people would sell them food and drink and so forth, and one of the staples was chips and eggs. You know, that's where their liking for that came, and so they were able to get the vitamins that they needed, but they also supplemented with fresh meat whenever they could. And there's actually vitamin C in fresh meat. It erodes the more you cook it, the longer it's cooked, but so their rations on the Western Front were much better than Gallipoli.